Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished professional with a deep understanding of human behavior and an author from Toronto, Canada, Paul Larche. Paul, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Paul is an author of a book titled The Divided Brain: Understanding Human Behavior in Branding and Business. He is a behavioral branding strategist and a media entrepreneur. So, Paul, my first question for you, can you explain the old brain versus new brain model in the simplest possible way for someone hearing it for the first time?
Well, absolutely. It's the metaphor that I came up with that allowed me to explain this to people who don't go to marketing school or haven't
Mhm.
had a marketing background. So the simplest explanation is that the old brain is the part of our brain that we share with lizards going back 475 million years.
Mhm.
And that's driven by emotion, protective systems, automation, things that happen that we are not even consciously aware of. And that's frankly where most of the decisions happen. The new brain is really the neocortex, and it's a new addition to our evolution. It's verbal, it's analytical, it's a lot slower.
Mhm.
The way they work together is the old brain really, for all intents and purposes, runs the show and makes decisions for us. So that's the de facto mode. And the new brain, more often than not, will rationalize those decisions.
Hmm.
And it rationalizes those decisions because more often than not, the old brain is correct. It's just a marvel of evolution. And it allowed our species to survive and thrive and reproduce by making laser quick decisions
Yeah.
that allowed us to keep on going.
Hmm.
And the new brain will more often than not rationalize that, although it is capable of doing a lot more than that.
Incredible. Brilliantly explained. Thank you. You described the old brain as processing around 11 million bits per second. What does this mean in practical real world terms?
Well, again, I think when if just like as I mentioned earlier, because the old brain is so old and so well tuned in terms of software, it can process so many things subconsciously. Look, just think of when you and I are talking here. I can read your face, your tone, your movement, your contrast.
Mm,
I can feel context. I can see emotional cues.
mm,
All of these things are happening in the old brain. It's so quick at doing that.
yeah.
And it's also at the same time keeping us alive. It's regulating your heartbeat. It's allowing you to move back and forth and talk and all of these things. So all of these things can happen in parallel. They're not happening in series. They can happen at the same time.
Mm,
And the 11 million bits. I mean, this is based on a few scientific studies that have been done. I think the real point is that I really want to put it into contrast with the new brain. Now, the new brain is very slow. It compared to the old brain. It can really only think in series, like it has to process one thing at a time. People think that they can multitask. That's just an illusion. You only can really focus on one thing at a time if you're engaging the new brain.
mm,
And so it's slow and it requires effort and it requires a lot more energy from our body, from the brain to do things. And that's why when we're thinking through complex issues or problems or concerns, it is taxing. We really
yeah.
can feel it.
Mm. Amazing. You talk about five filters, which are threat, return, status, contrast, and visual. Help us understand these five and give me an example if possible.
Well, absolutely. First, threat is first because that is, again, based on our evolution, the first thing that the old brain is always scanning for.
Mm,
Is this a threat to my survival? Is this a
mm,
threat to? And in the modern world that we live in, we're not threatened for our survival on a daily basis.
mm.
But it doesn't take away the fact that that's what the old brain is doing at a subconscious level.
Right.
So, what I talk about in branding and in business and in leadership is how can you how can you remove the risks that people might feel, or if there's any confusion or uncertainty. Otherwise, right away, your old brain is going to become a little bit defensive.
Mm,
And so you have to make sure that somehow through emotion, you're going to take away that threat. When it comes to return, it's, is it worth the effort? And there's a calculation that's going on between your old brain and new brain to say,
mm,
should I go ahead with it? Now, status is very important. Status is, that's where you're talking about yourself,
mm,
and it's where you stand. And people don't want to appear foolish. That's probably one of the big things I see today. We think
mm.
often of status as luxury items and goods, but it's so much more.
Yeah.
I want to look like I belong here. I want to look like I have something to contribute. And if you're not giving people a pathway to do that, it will affect how they feel with
Mm,
status.
mm,
And then, of course, visual is everything that we intake through all of our senses. I know it says visual, but
yeah.
at the end of the day, it's really status that's the
Mm,
important thing. So if you can make people feel like they belong and they're confident, and you can make sure you're protecting their pride and their identity, they're not going to feel foolish. You're going a long way to having them, listen to what you have to say.
amazing. You spoke a few minutes back about the new brain and how it generally rationalizes. Paul, if the new brain only rationalizes, why do we trust it so much?
Well, the new brain doesn't only rationalize, that is its de facto
Mm,
mode. And the reason that it does that again is because more often than not, the old brain is correct. The old brain is running on a combination of things. One is built into our DNA. We have certain predispositions that have been passed down through us evolutionarily, and that's built in. We can't really change that. A lot of the other things are just things that we learned in childhood that get burned into our old brain. You touch
mm,
a hot stove, you're not going to do it twice.
yeah.
All of these things come together to really develop the old brain's
Mm,
way of operating. Now, the new brain will, like I said, by default, rationalize an old brain decision because it's more often than not correct. But sometimes it isn't correct. And we can, I refer to in the book, I refer to the two brains as two gears that are interconnected.
mm,
The old brain is the larger gear that's driving the show, and the new brain is the smaller gear that's coming along for the ride.
mm.
We can through just thinking, forcing ourselves to think about it, and it's called metacognition. We can actually say, listen, I'm going to, press the clutch. I'm going to engage my new brain, and
Mm,
I'm going to try to disengage it from influences from the old brain and think
mm,
these things through.
mm.
And that's where a lot of great ideas come from. It's a combination of the old brain and new brain sending ideas back and forth. Most entrepreneurs are able to tap into that on occasion when they come in with great ideas. Scientific discoveries come out of
Mm,
there
mm.
where you're pushing against the old brain that doesn't like counterintuitive thinking to to think things through and to just basically engage in a type of critical thinking.
Very interesting. But tell me, are we truly rational, or is rationality always a constructed narrative?
Well, I think it's probably a little bit more of the latter than
Mm,
the first, because rationality is perceived by not only what you feel internally, but what your environment is telling you
mm,
externally. There's been times in our history where the norm was accepted during the Salem witch hunts in the 1600s. It was very scientifically they believed that there were witches. I mean, there's a whole bunch of examples of this through our history. So as much as people could have said then that they're being rational and they've studied it and they've engaged their new brain, if the information coming in was incorrect to start with,
yeah.
it didn't work. So it's really depending on the frame of reference you have and what you're looking at in terms of your data coming in. So
Wow.
in the book, I talk about trying to go back to first principles a lot
Mm,
because those are, for the most part, first principles. They're undisputable. They're
correct.
facts. And if you start at that foundation and you build up from there, you can think a little bit more rationally.
Mm,
But the default mode, unfortunately, is we don't think rationally, and
mm.
it's not a bad thing. It's just the way we it's just the way we're designed.
Correct, correct. Well said. Great response. Let's now change paths a little bit and move from the brain to using the brain and how leaders use it. And my
Mhm.
question is, how can leaders consciously design communication to pass the five filters you spoke about a few minutes back?
Well, again, I think the first thing a leader can do, and this is a leader's responsibility, no matter if you have a staff of one person or tens of thousands,
Yeah.
is you have to create that sense of reducing any perceived threat that
Mm,
people might have. When we talk leadership, and I owned a company for many years, I had many employees, and I made my share. But anytime I would get excited about a change, which I thought was for the better, I it I found that I got resistance with it early on. And
mm,
now that I know what I know, I could understand why. Because change, any type of change, is perceived as a threat to the old brain,
mm.
even though the change might be for the better.
Yeah.
So a good leader has to understand that. And when they're going to introduce something like change, we're going to take a new direction, or we're going to bring in a new staff member, or whatever it might be that's going to change the environment that a leader might be putting his group in. They really have to reduce that level of threat, and they
Mm,
have to be empathetic and really open up with, listen, you're going to feel uncomfortable about this. That's perfectly normal because we're talking about change.
mm,
Then you supply the new brain with all of the rationalization it's going to need to get this thing through. You
mm,
explain that, listen, the change we're going to do is going to result in this. There's going to be a couple of hiccups. We might take two steps forward and one step back, but ultimately we're going to get to this goal and we're going to be in a better position. And if you can frame it that way, using your own language, your own words, however you do it, you'll find as a leader that you're going to get a lot more buy-in, and people will just, again, that sense of threat is going to be mitigated to the point where they're going to feel, okay, I think I'm going to come along with this. The other thing with leadership is, again, this ties into just about the same thing, is the old brain, like I said, doesn't like change. It likes things to be familiar.
mm.
There's a big part of us that loves things that are familiar. That's why certain music, has a four chord structure, and the same hits come out of it, or stories are built on the same structure. Or that's why we go see sequel movies, because all of these things are really make us feel comfortable because we understand it. Now there's some novelty in there. They'll change the lyrics, or they'll change, who is the hero or the villain within the stories, but ultimately the system stays the same. And a good leader will use that to their advantage as well. They'll make sure that they're following a kind of a structure that feels familiar for people and doesn't feel like they're too out there. And often when you go out to there too far, you're going to fail, unfortunately. And this is one of the reasons why.
Wow. Amazing. So tell me, Paul, we've spoken about the old brain, which is always there, and the new brain, which could be rationalizing. How should a brand communicate differently if it understands the old brain is in charge?
Well, the first thing is to understand that the old brain is going to be looking for one thing, and that's what's in it for me. It
Mm,
wants to know how you're going to make its life better, how you're going to make it feel better, how you're going to take away threat. All of these things are what it's scanning for, and always has been and always will be.
mm,
And as a brand manager or a leader that is looking at positioning something like a brand,
mm,
the first thing you have to understand is how can we take away that barrier right away?
mm,
When I first put this to practice after doing a lot of studying on this and working at some agencies in Toronto and owned my first radio station,
Mm.
we had a car dealership, or I should say a mechanic that wanted to advertise with us. His name was Ted, and he wanted to talk about the two new bays that he opened with new diagnostic equipment, and he was
Mm.
very proud of that, and he wanted to advertise that on the radio. And putting the divided brain concept to work here, I pushed back with him a little bit and said, listen, tell me a little bit more about your place. He talked about his wife, Benita, who happened to be with him. And she perked up and said, you know what? Ted hasn't fixed my car in like 3 weeks because he always has his customers, ahead of me. And
Mhm.
that really became the the basis for how we're promoting it. It wasn't Bays, it was Ted will Ted fixes everybody's car except Benita's.
Mm.
And he would have this back and forth. They would ranter back and forth about how, Benita had to wait because his customers came first, but it was done with character. And that really, the old brain, that really brought the defenses down. Now,
Mm.
Ted went on, this campaign lasted for 20 years and his business grew. Bill, he ended up opening a few shops. He
Wow.
exited very successfully, but
Mm.
it was using that kind of mentality where it was not necessarily using the fact that he did have diagnostics and bays,
Mm.
although he would talk about that sometime. It was more about, the customer is going to come first, and even my wife's going to have to wait to get her car
Mm.
fixed.
Wow. Wow. Very interesting. Um, Given the fact that your book is titled The Divided Brain, and we've spoken about old brain and new brain,
Mhm.
how does understanding the divided brain make us a better leader?
Well, I think if you understand the mechanism behind it, and again, my metaphor of the divided brain, I'm trying to explain it in a way that is easy for people to grasp in a 5 minute conversation.
Mm.
And if people have taken anything away from this conversation, they understand, okay, there's two gears. There's the old brain and the new brain. The old brain makes the decisions. The new brain rationalizes, but we can press that clutch and have the new brain do a little bit more critical thinking.
Mm.
If they can understand that concept, then that really should explain a lot of what's going on in the world around them.
Mm.
How people are reacting, how are other marketers doing it, how are politicians convincing us of what their position is, no matter what side it's on.
Mm.
How are marketers getting through to us and triggering some of our biases and some of our inherent mechanisms that kept us alive? How are they doing? And once you get that awareness, once you know, okay, listen, there might be something else at play here, and I'm going to just take a step back here and think this through a little bit. I found, and this happened to me years ago, I found it very liberating. I found it that I could really see the world through a different lens. And
Mm.
I could, just by understanding that the way the mind works it's a masterpiece, really,
Yeah.
when you think of how it kept us alive through this. But it can malfunction sometimes. It can misfire in the modern world we're in because our environment has changed so much from when we were hunter gatherers or cavemen or however you
Mm.
want to position our ancestors. And just understanding that with using this kind of metaphor can really have you look at the world in a different way
Mm.
and also interact with it in a different way.
Mm. Amazing. How can individuals train themselves to recognize when their old brain has already decided? Or can they?
Well, yes and no, they can. Sometimes we go along even though we're aware of it. I talk in the book about I'm an amateur musician and I play guitar and and sometimes embarrassed to admit it, but I have 37 guitars,
Wow.
and I can honestly justify with
Each
my
one.
new brain
Yeah.
why I have each guitar.
Yeah.
There's a sentimental value. There's a certain tone it has. There's a certain era that it came from, and 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 we do that. But my guitars bring me a lot of joy, so I don't fight it. I understand why that gives me a certain sense of comfort. The old
Mm.
brain likes it. I
Mm.
get a lot of pleasure out of playing the guitar, and so. But I understand when I'm talking to anybody about my guitars, I'll just rationalize what why I have each one of them,
Mm.
and now I can laugh at myself because I know I'm doing that. But we can do that with anything. We can do it with how many shoes do you have, or how many suits do you have, or people. I have a Rolex. You can justify the craftsmanship,
Yeah.
the how well it's built, but at the end of the day, it's for status that I understand that, and
Correct.
like I said, I get how it works.
Mm.
So just understanding how it works is a big advantage. It also is a great filter for when you're getting exposed, like we are today, on social media
Mm.
and in, frankly, just the media.
Yeah.
Your screens, you're getting bombarded with information, and almost all of that information, for the most part, has a motive behind it, and the motive can be sincere, but more often than not in the world we live in, it's probably not.
Mm.
Somebody has an agenda that they're trying to get across. And our old brain way of working is, okay, well, I'm going to agree with that or don't. And if you do,
Mm.
you're going to get into that camp and then you're going to defend it with everything you've got. And again, understanding that this kept us alive for a long time can understand how we react that way. But we do have the capabilities today to actually press that clutch, to
Mm.
actually think things through a little bit and ask, what is the motive here? What are they trying to get across?
Mm.
Are they cherry picking information? Are they trying to hit the hot buttons in my new brain? Are they trying to lower my defense mechanisms? And just to be a bit skeptical. It's not bad to be a bit skeptical if you make that your default mode. Not to be negative,
Mm.
just to question things a little bit more. And
Mm.
I find that very liberating.
Mm. Amazing. Paul, I have time for two more questions for you.
Sure.
Does awareness of your framework, or can the awareness of your framework actually change behavior, or is just understanding?
It's a little of both. Like I just said, I think that understanding that I operate in this way, understanding that this is the framework, the mechanics of how the brain works when we're interacting with the real world. I can understand when I'm being played, but not all the time. Sometimes I'm being played because something is really good at it. And that's what AI concerns me about, is it's getting so good now
Yeah.
at understanding human behavior, at understanding how the old brain works, that it understands that it has to reduce threat and make you feel comfortable and make sure that your status is going to be looked after. It understands all of those things so well that it's getting better and better, that it's going to understand us better than we understand ourselves.
Mm.
And it'll be very hard for most people to uh, understand how they're being manipulated,
Yeah.
even though they are being manipulated by these levers that are being pushed by smart AI.
Mm.
So when you say, can we use it, or is it inevitable that we're going to
Mm.
succumb to it? Yes, you can use it. You can use it particularly in those cases. And I tell people that's the thing that you really have to be careful with now, is that with the way AI is going, it'll treat us like a pet at some point.
Yes.
It'll be able to push all of those buttons. And if you're not aware of that, if you have no understanding of why it's doing that, you're just going to be taken along for the ride.
Mm. Amazing. And my last question for you, um, if there's one shift or one lesson you want every viewer and listener to take away after reading your book, The Divided Brain, what would it be?
Well, the line I've used for my in this with my staff and for 40 years now is, we buy an emotion and we justify with fact.
Mm.
And if people can understand that, when I say buy, you could be selling something, but it's also when you're just trying to sell an idea or a concept.
Mm. Mm.
We are emotional machines. We are not thinking machines. Emotion comes first. And if you can understand that sequence, then that's going to open things up for you. Unfortunately, a lot of marketers get it the wrong way. They lead with the facts. They
Mm.
lead with the spreadsheets. They lead with the features. They lead with all of the things that often a business owner might be proud of.
Mm.
And then they'll come in and say, this is how it can make your life better. Unfortunately, you've lost people at that point.
Mm.
You have to open up in a way that's going to get them to lower their defenses. But then you do have to come in with the facts. You do have to give that new brain some good ammunition to justify
Hmm.
why you're feeling that way.
Yeah,
And really, that's the big takeaway. If people can understand that, we buy on emotion and we justify with fact, that can open up a lot of things.
very interesting. And on that note, Paul, I just want to say what a fascinating conversation this has been. I mean, you explained to me, to my viewers and listeners, so beautifully on the old brain, the new brain, the challenges we all face, the rationalization that we all do. And you've linked it so well with branding, communication, and decision making. Thank you for
Well, it's been
speaking
a
to me,
pleasure.
and good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.